today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly pretty challenging work. It's Andrea Dworkin's Right-Wing Women from 1983.
A provocative title, even now.
Definitely. And you might know Dworkin from her other books on sexual politics, things like woman hating or pornography. She consistently focused on, well, power dynamics between men and women.
And Right-Wing Women specifically, it asks this question. Why do some women gravitate towards and even actively promote conservative political movements? It seems counterintuitive to some.
So our mission here, our deep dive, is really to unpack Dworkin's analysis. We want to understand the forces she saw shaping these women's views.
And explore some of her conclusions, which can be quite surprising, maybe even uncomfortable. So basically, according to Dworkin, why do women join the Thorfy, right? What does that reveal about broader gender power dynamics?
Okay, let's get into it. One of the first things she tackles is this persistent idea, she calls it a rumor, that women are biologically conservative.
Exactly. That idea has been floating around forever, hasn't it?
It has. And what's really interesting is Dworkin's point about how this often starts as, well, male gossip, just casual opinions.
Right.
But then, because men historically dominated intellectual spaces, these opinions somehow get, elevated. They become theory or accepted fact.
Because women weren't in the room, basically. They weren't part of the conversation where their own fundamental nature was being decided.
Precisely. Men are discussing how women are, and suddenly it's treated as objective truth. That's the dynamic she's pointing to. Okay, so against that backdrop, Dworkin argues the right offers women something specific, something seemingly appealing.
Yes, the promise of form and rules, a stable, predictable order.
What does she mean by form being attractive?
Well, Dworkin's idea is that women often experience the world as a kind of mystery. Why? Because they've been systematically kept ignorant of how things really work, practical skills, societal mechanisms, power structures.
Excluded from the how-to manual of society.
Kind of, yeah. So in that context, form, a simple, fixed, predetermined order for society, biology, sex, it offers structure. It seems to banish confusion, gives ignorance a shape you can grasp.
So embracing restriction can feel like gaining control, in a weird way, if the alternative is just chaos.
That's the surprising takeaway she presents. If you feel lost in the dark, a detailed map, even a restrictive one, can feel like salvation.
And then the rules.
Similar idea. The right provides clear rules. If you feel you're in a world you didn't make and don't understand, having a set of instructions. Well, Dworkin argues it offers direction, a way to maybe navigate more safely.
And it's not just rules for women, is it? There's a promise about men, too.
Crucially, yes. The promise is that men, despite having what she calls absolute sovereignty in this system, will also follow these rules. So it creates this sense of perhaps mutual obligation, maybe even perceived protection for women.
Okay, to make this less abstract, Dworkin uses case studies. Let's start with Ruth Carter Stapleton.
Yeah, Stapleton's story, as Dworkin tells it, is really striking. She talks about her early marriage struggles, feeling intensely cold, threatening, unprotected.
And using escapes of every kind to cope.
Right, just trying to avoid breaking down completely. And then motherhood. It wasn't this idealized thing for her at all.
No, she was terrified, wasn't she? Which really contrasts with the usual narrative.
Absolutely. She found out she was pregnant and was filled with dread, felt even more trapped after the baby came, and then having 4 kids so quickly led her to, quote, total desperation, even though she loved them. It wasn't simple.
Then there's Anita Bryant. Her public image was so tied to that specific brand of religious conservatism.
And Dworkin paints a picture of someone under immense external control, particularly from her husband, Bob Greene.
He managed everything, her career, her religious life.
Pretty much. Bryant herself acknowledged it, even said she loved him for it, despite sometimes violent scraps, as she put it. And Greene apparently took pride in spanking their kids.
Wow. And this control influenced her public stances, like the anti-gay crusade.
Dworkin argues it did. Bryant felt hemmed in, desperate for his approval. Her public religious testimony, the anti-homosexual stuff, it initially caused her distress, but it came from wanting to do Christ's will, which day to day seemed to mean doing what her husband wanted.
And maybe a way to reconcile being a star with being an obedient wife.
That's part of Dworkin's analysis, yes. A complex internal conflict.
Okay, now Phyllis Schlafly. Dworkin sees her quite differently, doesn't she?
Very differently. Schlafly doesn't seem to have those same visible internal conflicts, according to Dworkin. She comes across as much more driven by, well, a clear desire for power.
Like she was possessed by Machiavelli, not Jesus.
That's Dworkin's evocative phrase, yeah. Like, she wanted to be the prince, very strategic, very focused on political goals.
Which played out in her fight against the ERA, reproductive freedom, the whole women's movement.
Exactly, a very determined political operator in Dworkin's portrayal.
So moving from individuals, Dworkin then digs into what she sees as foundational, the politics of intelligence. And she makes this incredibly blunt statement.
Men hate intelligence in women.
Yeah, that's a huge claim.
Yeah.
What's her reasoning? Surely it's more nuanced than that.
Well, her argument isn't necessarily about every man hating every intelligent woman personally. It's about how society, a male-dominated society, sets really strict limits on what kind of intelligence is acceptable in women. Okay. Essentially, she argues it's only tolerated if it serves very narrow functions ending in reproduction or whoring, as she puts it quite starkly. Anything beyond that, often met with hostility, dismissal, suppression.
Because intelligence, for Dworkin, is active. It acts on the world.
Exactly. A vitality of mind that acts directly in and on the world. It needs public life, consequences, discourse to thrive. If it's kept private, passive. It just withers. She quotes Florence Nightingale saying, "Intellect dies last in women after desire, dreams, activity, love."
And she uses that really disturbing analogy.
The starving child with the bloated belly looks swollen, but it's empty of real nourishment. Dworkin suggests women's intelligence denied real outlets can become like that, distorted, maybe misdirected, not truly functional.
And this starts early, in school.
She argues, yes, schools often teach girls compliance, not necessarily inquiry or the passion of knowing. Adventurous thinking might be discouraged. The goal, she suggests, is often implicitly about making them good wives, not independent thinkers.
Even smart girls are pushed towards finding a smarter husband, like Simone de Beauvoir.
That's an example Dworkin implies fits this pattern. It's about using intelligence for something deemed acceptable within the existing structure.
And ultimately, it's about silencing women's own stories, questions, ideas, anything beyond reproduction.
Yeah, their unique perspectives get sidelined, deemed less relevant than the dominant male narrative.
Which brings us to literacy. She sees it as a crucial tool, but also a basic capacity.
Right. Literacy is power. It's like fire a tool for intelligence, essential for finding meaning. And historically, it's been denied to marginalized groups, including women, quite deliberately.
But even when some women did get literacy, it wasn't always straightforward, was it?
No, Dworkin points out it often came with strings attached. Maybe courtesans, upper-class women got some literacy, but it was usually tied to accepting specific roles, sexual objects, decorative figures.
And if they used literacy for anything else, anything outside feminine topics.
Punishment, contempt, ostracization. Dworkin quotes Virginia Woolf here about women waiting for men to become civilized enough so they could finally talk honestly about their own bodies, their experiences.
That constraint, avoiding your own body in language, Dworkin calls it annihilation.
Because if your language can't touch your own reality, it has no real power, no real place.
Okay, so building on this, Dworkin distinguishes between creative and moral intelligence. What's the difference for her?
Creative intelligence is intelligence in action in the world. It needs recognition, consequence. And women, she argues, are systematically denied the respect this kind of intelligence needs. Even if they have it, they might be pressured to renounce it for male approval.
Like the woman with great ideas in the boardroom who gets ignored.
Exactly that kind of thing. And moral intelligence, for Dworkin, it's not just following rules.
Right, she contrasts it with moralism.
Yes. Moralism is like rote learning of rules designed to keep women in their place. Moral intelligence is active discernment, using your judgment in the real world, making ethical choices. It has to operate publicly, involve real decisions with impact.
So it's about having the agency to apply judgment, not just knowing the rules.
That's the key difference she's highlighting. Freedom and power to act on your understanding.
Which leads us to maybe one of the most challenging concepts. Sexual intelligence.
Dworkin argues this cannot exist defensively or just decoratively for women. It must be rooted in a woman owning her own body, understanding it.
And she lists things that murder this capacity.
Yes, incest, rape, violation, forced chastity being given away in marriage, prostitution. All these forms of violence and control, she argues, destroy the potential for a woman to develop her own sexual intelligence.
Because if your sexuality is just defined by what men do to you,
there's no space left for your own desire, your own boundaries, your own agency. Women live in this private world of sexual usage, often without honest confrontation.
She brings in Victoria Woodhull here.
A fascinating figure. Woodhull challenged the double standard, demanded sexual self-determination for women, the right to own their bodies completely.
And Woodhull saw the link between forced sex in marriage and forced pregnancy.
Absolutely. She protested against women having to give up control over their reproductive capacity. Now, Dworkin connects this to right-wing women's views,
Suggesting their perspective comes from a fear of vulnerability, especially with the idea of impersonal sex.
Yes, that's Dworkin's interpretation, that perhaps they see privatized male ownership marriage as the safer bet in a patriarchal world.
So they understand their value is tied to sex and reproduction.
And so they use terms like femininity, total woman, to try and sort of increase their value within that system. They also recognize, Dworkin suggests, that intelligence in women is often seen as a negative.
So sex and babies become the better survival strategy.
That's the argument she puts forward. And this leads to her distinction between animal and human intelligence.
Right? Animal intelligence is just survival.
Basically, yeah, doing what you need to do to get by in the environment you're in. Human intelligence, for Dworkin, involves intellectual freedom, critical thought, self-determination beyond just staying alive.
All right, let's shift to abortion. This is obviously a huge topic in the book. Dworkin starts with some surprising statistics about illegal abortions, right?
Crucially, yes. She points out that most women getting illegal abortions back then were actually married, already had children.
Which completely challenges the narrative that it was all about single women and promiscuity.
Completely. And the secrecy around it wasn't just about the law. It was about intense social stigma, shame, judgment specifically aimed at women.
Dworkin says it felt like admitting to being raped.
Yeah.
That level of vulnerability.
Yes, exposing this unbearable loss of control, this deep vulnerability. She also analyzes the male perspective.
The killing of a son idea.
Right. This feeling some men have, she argues, this retroactive sense of murder, like, if my mother had the choice, I wouldn't exist. The male ego identifies with the potential, the fertilized egg, asserting power over the woman's body.
While women's reality, Dworkin reminds us, often included forced sex within marriage.
Leading to resentment, a longing for freedom, for bodily autonomy. Intercourse, often forced in marriage, she argues, is a central issue, a systematic expression of male power, often protected by the state.
And the exceptions, sometimes debated rape, incest, she sees those as primarily about male concerns. Property, lineage.
Often, yes, rather than genuine concern for the woman. We saw figures like Henry Hyde opposing abortion even after rape. Dworkin's point is that abortion tends to be tolerated only when it clearly serves male interests.
Now, Dworkin doesn't spare the left either, does she? She critiques their version of sexual liberation.
No, she definitely doesn't. Her core critique is that the left's sexual liberation ideology often completely failed to address forced sex or the underlying subordination of women.
So freedom for women just meant being available for sex more often with more men.
That's how Dworkin characterizes it. A kind of horizontal mobility, as you said, within the same unequal system. There was little accountability for male violence, and women were often blamed if they didn't comply sexually.
Punished for having limits preferences.
Exactly. If their desires didn't align with their brother lovers, they faced consequences. And she makes the sharp observation that some leftist men seem to lose interest in political activism once easy sex wasn't guaranteed.
She also notes the idea of fetal psychology started on the therapeutic left, before the right took up fetal personhood politically.
Yes, an interesting historical point. And the argument that abortion was genocide against Black people gained traction, despite the reality that Black and Hispanic women were dying disproportionately from illegal abortions.
And the traditional silence around sex in marriage meant mothers couldn't really prepare daughters.
Right. Compliance was presented as natural, force wasn't acknowledged. So when sexual liberation arrived, daughters weren't equipped to navigate it, understand the potential dangers Dworkin saw.
Okay, so turning back to right-wing women's views on abortion. Dworkin says they see legal abortion as making women
accessible fucks without consequence for men. That's their accusation, she reports.
because pregnancy is the only thing holding men accountable.
That's their perceived logic, according to Dworkin. They see men, left and right, as fundamentally self-serving when it comes to sex and abortion, if it's purely about female self-determination. So right-wing women, she argues, pragmatically try to make the best deal for survival in the system as it is.
And that deal, for some, meant accepting illegal abortion to keep pregnancy as leverage.
That's Dworkin's stark interpretation, maybe internalizing the shame, believing they deserved punishment for sex outside their deal. Accepting illegal abortion avoids confronting the choice not to be a mother, and it keeps women isolated.
And she notes this disturbing belief among some, that women who refuse childbirth deserve to die, and accepting that judgment even against themselves.
It's a truly chilling point. Dworkin concludes that their opposition to legal abortion is, in a way, a measure of what forced sex does to women, how it damages their will to self-determination.
Okay, let's move to homosexuality.
Yeah.
The right often uses specific religious texts here.
Romans 1 is key, yes. Dworkin highlights verse 26 about women changing the natural use into that which is against nature, and the condemnation of men too.
But she contrasts this with the Old Testament and Maimonides.
Right. She argues that while lesbian practices were forbidden, they didn't carry the same severe penalties or intense condemnation found in Romans or in the modern fundamentalists.
Right. And she discusses the International Women's Year Conference in Houston and the presence of right-wing groups with alleged Klan links. That's pretty shocking.
It's a very disturbing part of the book. She talks about the Mississippi and Utah delegations. The Mississippi one was all white, representing a state with a large black population, and there were allegations of Klan involvement in selecting them.
The IWY Commission itself was concerned about the racist makeup of some delegations.
Yes. And Dworkin recounts meeting a man there who actually claimed to be a KKK Grand Dragon.
Wow. What was that scene like?
She describes this wall of silence from the Mississippi women, and the man justifying the Klan's presence, protecting white women from lesbians, preserving the family, spouting racist and anti-Semitic bile, linking homosexuality to Jews.
Fear of homosexuality, corrupting kids, destroying the family.
That was his explicit line. Dworkin also describes one woman knitting silently, this eerie, menacing presence. When she tried talking to the Mississippi women, one whispered about opposing the ERA because girls would have to go to war.
And another believed Christian women were superior, didn't want ERA responsibilities, saw difference as God's will and homosexuality as sin.
Exactly. A very different interaction than with the Utah delegation.
How were they different?
The Utah delegates, though conservative and Mormon-influenced, actually mingled with feminists. They were passionate against abortion, but also framed opposition to the ERA and federal programs in terms of states' rights and protecting the male-headed family.
Okay, so Dworkin then connects homophobia and racism as broader tools of control.
Yes. Fear of homosexuality manipulates men, she argues, creating this endless quest for unimpeachable masculinity. And racism stereotypes black men either as hypersexual threats or as desexualized, feminized figures.
Both driven by the dominant group's insecurity about its own masculinity.
That's her analysis. Yeah. She even brings in the Nazis' obsession with masculinity and their scapegoating of Jewish men for supposedly stealing it by taking their women.
And the historical link between Jews and homosexuals, referencing Romans again.
Yes, she analyzes Paul's strategy linking Jews and their supposedly ineffective law with unnatural homosexuals.
Offering this really provocative reading of Jesus?
Suggesting Paul presented Jesus' suffering as feminine, but his resurrection as a triumph of Christian masculinity over effeminate Jews and their weak law. A framework, she argues, that fueled anti-Semitism.
It's definitely a controversial interpretation. She also points out that Old Testament views, even on things like sex with young boys historically, or the Sodom story,
don't necessarily justify the intense hatred of homosexuality you see on the fundamentalist.
Right.
She really pins that escalation, that specific vitriol towards both Jews and homosexuals on Paul, perhaps driven by a desire for power against the Jewish establishment.
And she proposes this cynical idea of a political trade-off between some Jewish leaders and the Christian right.
The idea being that male Jewish leaders might support anti-abortion stances to boost the Jewish population, benefiting Israel and male dominance. Building a strong, militarized Israel helps dissociate Jewish men from perceived femininity.
And allying with the Christian right helps repudiate homosexuality, reinforcing male dominance.
That's the political dynamic she suggests might be at play.
Okay, returning to women's value. Dworkin argues it's incredibly limited, even as mothers.
Right. Motherhood doesn't guarantee safety. She mentions pregnant women being battered, and that chilling realizations some women have. Without the children, I am not. Their whole identity is tied up.
Right-wing ideology reinforces this, confining women to the home through childbearing.
Leaving them with nothing else, she argues. She contrasts how men might see babies necessary for wars with women's fear of their own function, their worth becoming extinct.
And homosexuality makes women seem expendable in this view. by negating their reproductive necessity for men.
That's the fear she identifies. It taps into this deep anxiety, this curse of childbearing and sorrow from Eden, contrasted with someone like Schlafly's euphoric view. Homosexuality raises the specter of utter barrenness, having nothing, not even childbirth, as a source of worth.
So beneath the total woman persona is this terror of being worthless if men don't need babies.
Yes, the womb is her wealth, childbearing her strongest tie to men. Homosexuality triggers, for some women, Dworkin describes, a terror of extinction.
Dworkin then talks about genocidal policies. How does she define that?
She argues that women's expendability, especially women of color whose marginalization obscures the role of gender, is systemic. The snuff film ads are an extreme example of devaluing women's lives. Fundamentally, she says, a woman is reduced to her uterus and her political condition.
So racist population programs, policies targeting the poor, the old, the institutionalized, these are genocidal.
Because those groups are overwhelmingly women, she argues U.S. policy increasingly protects reproducing middle-class white women while punishing others through things like the Family Protection Act, social program cuts, and the booming porn industry is more evidence of female expendability.
Even moral adherence doesn't protect you if you're too old or poor to reproduce. Your fate depends on the state's desired use of your uterus.
That's her grim assessment, which leads to her description of nursing homes.
She calls them houses of death.
Concentration camps. Over 72% women, often poor widows, neglected, degraded, subjected to sadism, markedly white, suggesting black people die younger from systemic racism.
And serving to keep old, useless white women out of sight.
That's her suggestion. Heavily drugged, neglected, abused. Even in old age, she concludes, a woman needs a man for protection because society hasn't granted her an independent place. A lifetime of economic discrimination leaves her resourceless.
The displaced homemaker becomes the old woman put away.
Exactly, and this lack of autonomy is echoed in female drug dependency.
The tranquilizer and pill use she cites is staggering.
Valium was the most prescribed drug for a while. She argues the female role necessitates these drugs. Male doctors often dismiss female patients as emotional, irrational.
So they treat complaints with tranquilizers instead of investigating, echoing hysteria.
Right. Drugs used to keep women calm, numb, asleep, dulling their minds, suppressing vitality.
And surgical control, beyond historical clitoridectomies.
She discusses the attempted revival of psychosurgery, with black women seen as ideal candidates due to perceived violence in just being black women. Lobotomy was pitched as maintaining their domestic labor capacity.
She connects this to the failure of welfare to create cheap black female labor.
And welfare itself. She sees it as another tool of control.
Even though it looks like support.
She argues it functions to control women in old ways. AFDC, mostly women and kids, shows the state's low valuation of women. Racism makes it worse for black women. The degradation comes from sexual contempt, paternalism, moral codes applied only to women.
Police state authority for women without husbands. Suitable employment forcing them into degrading work.
Yes. Impossible standards compared to the pressure on middle-class women to stay home. Historically, suitable homes laws penalized illegitimate children, any deviation from convention. Welfare's mission, she argues, was always punishment for sex and kids outside marriage for being women.
The real causes of need are economic and sexual degradation, but welfare just provides bare maintenance.
And those forced off often get jobs paying even less. High unemployment for women heading households. She even mentions college grads in the sex industry as proof of limited options. Welfare, seeking reproductive containment, intrudes, especially for poor women, black women, under the guise of morality applied only to them.
So millions of women kept in line by drugs are also part of this throwaway population.
Their well-being is subordinated. Dworkin asks, what value do they really have? They already matter little. What happens when reproduction isn't exclusively female, especially if men can make babies?
Which leads to the brothel model and reproductive tech.
The brothel model women for sex. No reproduction needed, no one owes them anything, is a warning for women outside marriage motherhood. Some on the left saw this separation as freedom.
But Dworkin sees it as commodifying sex, linking sex and money.
Exactly. Making women interchangeable, free, only when doing what men find sexy. It obscures the female condition. Marriage's purpose was reproduction and male dominance. Now, tech changes the terms of control.
We're from sloppy social control to precise medical control.
Yes. AI, IVF, sex selection. The womb becomes the province of the doctor, not the woman. Reproduction becomes another commodity, like sex, controllable by men like never before. The issue isn't the tech itself.
But how it's used in a system where women are already commodities.
Precisely.
And the irony, right-to-life groups are the main opposition to IVF.
But they're also enabling state control by pushing laws, defining when life begins, giving the state power over the uterus and the egg.
Okay, finally, anti-feminism. How does Dworkin break that down?
She says it operates via sex-based insult, defensiveness against the language of the rapist. She outlines 3 models supporting it: separate but equal, woman superior, and male dominant.
She's harsh on separate but equal.
Very. Points to U.S. racial segregation, separation was real, equality a lie. Applied to sex, different natures mean separate spheres, home versus world, separate roles, rational man versus emotional woman.
Even with women in the workforce, segregation persists in female job ghettos because female subordination feels natural.
That's her argument for its effectiveness. The woman superior model is manipulative, giving false power in a limited sphere, and male dominant is the basic foundation male needs dictate everything.
And anti-feminists deny the sex-specific nature of crimes like rape, accuse feminists of denying common humanity.
Yes, they ignore the politics of the sex class system, pushing the "we're all in this together" line. Feminism, Dworkin insists, needs rigorous analysis of sex class, acknowledging exploitation and violence.
Male supremacy survives not because of biology or God.
But if the will to liberation fails, if women can't confront male power. And she ends with this circle of crimes against women.
Prostitution as the material reality, porn as the ideology. Anti-feminism operates whenever any group sacrifices some women to sex class oppression. Most ideologies are implicitly anti-feminist because women get sacrificed to higher goals.
Men promise protection to some women by sacrificing others.
Exactly. And women are sacrificed by race or class to keep the system going.
Wow. Okay. This deep dive into right-wing women, it's definitely challenging, a really unsettling perspective on the forces shaping women's roles, their choices.
It absolutely highlights the complex, often uncomfortable interplay. Dworkin saw social, political, economic factors all tangled up in gender dynamics.
And even though it's from the 80s, you can see how her arguments still provide this valuable, maybe provocative context for today's discussions about gender, power, autonomy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We really hope you'll take some time to just, mull over these ideas, think about how they might resonate or maybe clash with your own observations of the world. Yeah. And on that note, maybe a final thought to leave you with. If we take Dworkin's analysis seriously, even just as a thought experiment, what do you think are the biggest barriers still stopping women from achieving real, complete self-determination today?